really delighted to welcome Professor James Ladyman to Bristol Humanists to help us think about whether science tells the truth. James is Professor of Philosophy at Bristol University and describes himself as working chiefly in the philosophy of science and physics, but is interested in most areas of philosophy. Well, I spent a bit of time looking at his talks and debates and discussions online, and it seemed to me he was interested in pretty much everything and brought to bear considerable knowledge of many disciplines in his thought. So it wasn't a surprise to me that he's part of the Centre for Science and Philosophy at Bristol University. That's a place for intellectual inquiry and study, but it also encourages engagement with the wider public and has events, including discussions on the ethical, social and political issues arising from scientific practice and research. Another project he's involved in is the Thinking Science project, in which the philosophy department and science teachers and educators have collaborated to produce resources for Key Stage 3 science education. These are available nationally and internationally, and the Association for Science Education described them as a resource that just makes you stop and wish you could find more of them. If you'd like to explore James's work further, you could try his books, What is a Complex System?, Materialism, a Historical and Philosophical Inquiry, and Understanding Philosophy of Science. I'll put the details of those on the website for you to find if you'd like to. So thank you very much for coming, James, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone who's going to be listening to this evening. I'm going to talk about reliability, science and truth, and I have this subtitle, Science Often Tells the Truth, but Not Always the Whole Truth or Nothing But the Truth. What more can we say about how and when science is a reliable source of belief? I'm going to begin with the argument that scientists are like bees, which is due to Francis Bacon. And at the time when he advocated this, he couldn't possibly have known, although he seemed to have guessed what might be possible. He said, those who have handled sciences have either been men of experiment or men of dogmas. The men of experiment are like the ant. The reasoners resemble spiders. But the bee takes a middle course. It gathers its material from the flowers of the garden and digests and transforms it by a power of its own. And, according to Bacon, this will enable us to have great knowledge which will transform society for the better. So in modern terms, I think we can say that Bacon thought that human beings could create a social machine that would vastly improve their well-being by producing reliable knowledge. And that's what I'm going to argue that science at its best is. He was right. This is important for humanists. I looked up the Amsterdam Declaration at which the founders of humanism stated their founding principles. And they're here on the screen for you to see. I won't read them all out. But the second one says that humanism is rational. And when we look for further clarification of what that means, it says the following: humanism seeks to use science creatively, not destructively, and so on, advocates the application of the methods of science and free inquiry to improve human welfare. Humanism believes that science gives us the means, but human values must propose the end. So science is obviously very important to humanism. And indeed, it is true that this is because the reliability and success of scientific knowledge that's been produced since the scientific revolution is comparable to what Bacon envisaged in his famous book, New Atlantis. Technology, based on advanced scientific theories from many disciplines, is taking over even now. Before, we really used to use technology to do things that we couldn't do, multiply, or to do things that we could do, but it would take us a very long time. Like multiplying very big numbers, to make a trivial example. But now technology is taking over our most basic cognitive functions, including, often, decision-making, memory, and navigation. And it's ironic, therefore, that although many people rely almost entirely on the reliability of scientific knowledge for their survival, most people know almost little or nothing about most, if not all, of science. In particular, it's certainly not well understood in general what makes science reliable and what its limits are, even by scientists. And recently, some of you may have heard of the dispute about the reliability of science in some areas that comes under the heading of the replicability crisis. Science is so invisible and so much taken for granted that wholesale science denial is voiced. Oh, that Mr. Line there, sorry. Science is according to me, and I'm going to argue for this, science is a complex social system and its reliability is emergent from the repeated interactions of the individual scientists and their technology. And so that's why scientists are like bees. The coordinated behavior of eusocial insects like bees emerges spontaneously from their repeated interactions without there being an overall controller bee. I'll return to this theme throughout this talk. An example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, though, is the averaging out of observations to wash out errors, all the way to the social technology of peer-reviewed journals. The idea is that all these mechanisms contribute to the emergence of the reliability of scientific knowledge when they work well. We need to better understand these processes, or should I say to understand better, or better to understand these processes to improve and maintain the reliability of science, and so that non-scientists can have appropriate trust in science. So, although I've said a lot about how I think science is very reliable, let me point out that, of course, science is the worst way to find out about the world apart from all the rest. That is to say, science is far from perfect. Science may be great, but it's not infallible, far from it. And in some cases, science can be terribly wrong. So to what extent does science really even give us the means, as humanists think it does? And to what extent is science really independent of our values? You notice that declaration of humanism suggested that there's a kind of distinction, a value distinction. Science gives us means, but values must inform how we use those means. Is it that straightforward? Some science, you might think, is not independent of our values, and I'll come back to that. So what I'm going to do, talk about reliability, as promised. And here I'm talking largely about the reliability of belief, or the production of knowledge, and in particular propositional knowledge. That is to say, not knowing how, but knowing that. And I'll talk about science, by which I will say more about how we should think about science more in a more detailed way. But I'm going to use the term science to include the community of inquiry, the methods, the theories, and to some extent the resulting technology. And when I talk about truth, I'll be talking about truth of belief, truth of propositions being true or false. I will have less to say about truth than almost anything else, but we can talk about it in the questions. But here's the point. Science, as I said, clearly no one sensible thinks that science tells us the whole truth. That is to say, there are truths that science does not tell us, and science does not tell us only the truth. There are many instances of science telling us something false. And these two ways that science can be unreliable are going to be a big theme of my talk. Let's just talk about reliability, and I will talk about this in several different aspects to this. So I'll begin by saying something about experts, lay people, and epistemic communities. Then I'll say something about testimony, and then I'll talk about epistemic institutions and epistemic authority. Let me begin with a kind of standard popular view, I think, that we often get portrayed. There are experts, there are lay people. Experts tell people what to believe. Lay people believe what they're told. This is wrong. Right? Why is it wrong? It's wrong because in general, in fact, experts have to believe what they're told more than non-experts. Because being an expert requires so much knowledge, and it requires knowledge of subsidiary and related areas to such an extent, that to be an expert in any one field requires trusting people for their knowledge about other fields. And moreover, almost nobody in almost no fields can be an expert in the sense of knowing everything about that field, unless the field is defined in a very, very highly specialized way. So it's just not true that there are two kinds of people: experts who tell people what to believe and lay people who believe what they're told. This is incorrect. All of us fundamentally believe pretty much everything that we believe, because we're told, and because to some extent to a massive extent, we enter into collaboration with others in order to know, and in particular in science, collaboration is absolutely essential. Just to take a trivial example, for example, if you want a trivial example, a simple example, one that's obviously incredibly salient to us at the moment, you can only spot an emerging infectious disease with a large data set. Individual doctors are largely powerless to acquire knowledge about disease. What's required is large data sets so that patterns can be observed across populations. So collaboration, absolutely essential. In general then, science is social knowing. And the scientific community is an example of what I'm calling an epistemic community. So epistemic just means to do with knowledge. It's a knowledge community. It's not an accident that modern science began with institutions like universities and societies for natural philosophy, and that it's developed into a vast social infrastructure that's embedded in education, business, government, and more or less every aspect of life for many people. But how and when to trust it, to what degree, in what respects? Well, let's think about a bit more about the role of testimony in our lives. As I've said, pretty much everything we believe is based on testimony. But importantly, this doesn't just mean believing what other individuals tell us. It means believing the social structures that have been designed for their production of reliable information. To take a trivial example, the registry office. The registry office records births and deaths, marriages and divorces, and records are meticulously kept and stored so that those records are reliable, so that we can trust them. The idea that in general we should make up our own minds about things is completely absurd, despite the fact that lip service is often paid to this idea, and people often don't think through the ramifications of it. If we were to make up our own minds about everything, we'd be ignoring the fruits of the labors of our ancestors. We really shouldn't be wondering if everything's made of earth, air, fire, and water, just because so many of our ancestors in so many cultures tried so hard to make that theory work and ended up giving up on it. So how can testimony, to focus on, to think about reliability, the limits of reliability, then we need to think about unreliability. And we need to think about the two ways that testimony can be unreliable. Testimony can be unreliable because we get false report or because we get no report. So analogous here are sins of act versus sins of omission. If I fail to tell you something true, that's analogous to omitting to do a good act, perhaps to save someone's life. If I tell you something false, that's analogous to committing a wrong act, like killing someone. And arguably, it can be just as wrong to fail to save life as to take life. And arguably in epistemic matters, it can be just as wrong to fail to report as it is to falsely report. So for example, a witness might confabulate details. I mean, indeed, this witness might not be dishonest, but they're still unreliable. They confabulate details. A different kind of failure of a witness or unreliability of a witness is a witness that forgets details. A news channel can falsify stories, but it could also ignore certain events. A politician can lie, but they might also keep quiet about the truth that they know. Well, those of you with any kind of scientific statistical education might already be thinking, he's talking about false positives and false negatives, and indeed I am. And the classic example here would be a test for a disease that can be unreliable in two different ways. It can give a false positive, or it could give a false negative. That is, the disease could tell you, the test could tell you that you have the disease when you don't, or it could tell you that you don't have the disease when you do. And these two ways of going wrong are obviously very different. And in general, a test that's very good in one respect is quite likely to be not so good in the other. These are called type 2 and type 1 errors in statistics. Now, what science can never tell us is what the consequences will be of false positives or false negatives in a given situation. So whilst it might be just a kind of scientific matter, whether or not, let's say we get a false positive in a test for a disease, the consequences of that false positive may be very different, nothing to do with science, but just depending on other factors. For example, if a false positive in a test for a disease results in a text message saying, you may have this disease, please be extra careful, then we might think there's a very low cost to that false positive result. On the other hand, if a false positive in a test for a disease results in you being forcibly deprived of your liberty and placed into quarantine, then obviously the consequences of a false positive are much more serious. You've been deprived of your liberty and you didn't have the disease. So I picked another couple of examples here. There's not a great cost to a false positive in an astronomical survey for Earth-like planets. You know, you think you found an Earth-like planet, you go back, you have another look, you find, oh, it was a false positive, it wasn't really there. It's not really a big deal. Maybe a mining survey reports that there's some mineral or oil. This has a kind of intermediate cost. Okay, the company invests a bit of time in going and checking to see whether there really was the mineral or oil or whatever it was found, and okay, if it wasn't really there, then there's been a cost incurred. But clearly the cost is not so great as, for example, the cost of being deprived of depriving lots of people of their liberty because you use a test which has a high false positive rate. Here's another example. A false positive when someone is arrested is very bad. The police have arrested someone innocent, but it's nowhere near as bad as a false positive when someone is convicted. The failure to ban asbestos as a building material is very bad. The failure to ban lead in children's toys is bad. Maybe not quite as bad as failing to ban asbestos as a building material. Now, clearly, the dimensions in which we judge these to be the consequences of these failures have nothing to do with the science in question. They have to do with the social and human context. Another example, the drug that's inefficacious being approved for use is like a false positive. An efficacious drug that is not approved for use is like a false negative. So how do we engineer epistemic reliability? And here's a very important point is we have to engineer it. It doesn't just happen by accident. We know, for example, that careful, slow judgment is on the whole better than rushing to judgment. And this is true for individuals, and it's also true for collectives. And I'm not going to catalogue all the ways in which we could try to make ourselves as individuals reliable, whether in everyday life or in science, but here's a simple example. As an individual, you may have learned the maxim, measure twice, cut once. In order to be reliable when building or doing carpentry or whatever it is, well, measure twice. That will increase your reliability. A collective or social example of epistemic reliability is the phrase which many of us will not have heard for a while and may not hear for a long time. Again, doors to manual and cross-check. The point about that is the airline industry is engineering epistemic reliability. They do not want any errors. And the airline industry is a great example of how incredibly reliable human beings can, how incredibly reliable human beings can engineer their systems to be when the stakes are high enough and they really want to. It's extremely rare for airliners just to drop out the sky because the standards are so high and because there are so many protocols. So for example, the cross-checking of the doors is just one example. The pre-flight checks that the pilot makes will often be also checked by the co-pilot or by the engineer. So there's a double checking as a collective way of engineering reliability in a social process. So here are some examples of what I regard as pretty reliable forms of inquiry. And all of these are fallible and none of them are perfect, but I'd say they're pretty good. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency issues tide tables and weather forecasts. I don't remember ever doubting or hearing anybody else doubt tide tables when at the seaside. But of course, it's a massive human cognitive achievement, the collective work of generations of people to arrive at the point where we have reliable predictions of the tides all over the country. It's something that we're so used to. We just assume we ought to have that kind of knowledge. And we've forgotten about the age in which we didn't have science and we didn't have these forms of epistemic reliability. We're so used to taking them for granted. Another example I like to say to people is, when was the last time the scientists said there was going to be a solar eclipse and they got it wrong? When was the last time they said there was going to be a meteor shower and they got it wrong, etc.? Okay, the Met Office, some extent epistemically reliable in forecasting, but very reliable in record keeping. The Office of National Statistics, the Coroner's Court. Coroners have incredible powers compared to other courts, and they have a highly structured process in order to arrive at cause of death. Public inquiry is another example. So these are all institutional structures that enable reliable judgment. The processes involved are highly specialized and structured. And despite people's skepticism often about broadcast and published media, we should note that they are subject to many legal and regulatory constraints. Newspaper journalists have to get things past lawyers. There are requirements to some extent of fact-checking. These mechanisms are almost entirely absent in many new forms of media, most of which have been engineered not to facilitate reliability, but to facilitate accessibility and immediacy. Bizarrely, though, many people seem to be extremely credulous about what they hear on social media. That is, they just believe things that they hear, while being extremely skeptical about the information disseminated by the institutions that have been engineered to be reliable. Now let's just think a bit more about epistemic institutions and epistemic authority. And my main argument is going to be here that epistemic authority is vital, that is, deference to authority is important, but the authority in question is the authority of institutions and social processes, not of individuals and their judgments and pronouncements. So in all the epistemically reliable social processes that I've discussed, individual judgment and pronouncements play a role, but none of them is decisive on their own. And here we can remind ourselves about bees. When bees choose a new nest site, individual bees come back to the hive and they use the waggle dance which they used to report the location of pollen to their fellows. They used the same dance to report the location of suitable nest sites. And other bees start copying or not copying individual bees that are promoting particular sites. And over time, eventually, there'll be a quorum reached. The majority of bees will all be dancing the same way, as it were. And then the hive will collectively all take off and go to the chosen site. And the bees that were advocating a different site do not go to that different site. They go to the site that's been chosen by the hive collectively. So in my example, by the colony collectively. So my point here is that the processes that issue authoritative scientific knowledge are like this. They are social processes in which individual judgments play a role but aren't definitive. A classic example of this is Einstein and quantum physics. Einstein, at the time in 1925-ish, when quantum mechanics was really entered its maturity, Einstein was very unhappy with it as a physical theory, and he opposed it in various ways. He couldn't have been more authoritative as an individual at that time. The generation of quantum physicists looked up to him immensely as someone who'd inaugurated a revolution in physics, who'd made immense contributions not only to space-time physics, but also to quantum physics itself. In fact, writing one of the first papers, in fact, two of the first papers on quantum physics in 1905, one on the photoelectric effect, one on photons, and then later in the 19-teens, working on quantum statistics. And yet his opinion really counted for absolutely nothing when it came to whether or not quantum mechanics was ultimately accepted. The community said, well, sorry, Einstein, you are great, but we collectively reject your view. And Einstein kind of dropped out the scientific community to some extent. He went to Princeton, to the Institute for Advanced Study, and he spent the latter part of his life really outside of the mainstream of theoretical physics, and unfortunately, sadly, contributed really nothing to the progress of physics for many years of his life, because he failed to do what the community was doing. So this community aspect of scientific authority and theory choice is essential from my point of view. We misunderstand authority in science if we think of it as a hierarchy with an individual at the top. It is not like that. And in academia more generally, authority is distributed through a network of specialized expertise with multiple high points. Reliable experts know a lot of what they don't know and don't think they know what they don't, and are honest about their limitations. On the other hand, science denial often involves following iconoclastic authors and texts, as opposed to the collective wisdom of the worldwide scientific community, much of it inherited from a global community over millennia. So, for example, Pythagoras' theorem was known not only to the ancient Greeks, but to the ancient Chinese and the ancient Indians. Vaccination was known in China and the Ottoman Empire before it was discovered or adopted in Europe. And the idea of a round Earth orbiting the sun, with the moon orbiting the Earth and causing the tides, was known to an ancient Babylonian astronomer, even though it wasn't accepted widely within the scientific community until the early or mid 17th century. So, on the one hand, we have credulity. On the other hand, we have skepticism. More generally, we can ask, okay, things often follow patterns, but how much evidence do we need before we infer that the future will be like the past? When is epistemic caution excessive? Not just when it comes to believing what people tell us, but when it comes to making inferences about the world? Well, I say that we should sort of subordinate ourselves to epistemic authority. I'll come back to the question of excessive caution in a moment, but let me just point out, I think it's really vitally important that people realize that epistemic authority is not the same thing at all as economic or social authority. It's not the same thing as popularity or wealth. I think a lot of the problem at the moment is that people are conflating these different kinds of authority and status. So they reject temporal and economic power and authority and think that scientific power or knowledge and authority is somehow to be associated with that economic and social authority they wish to reject. And note that epistemic authority is specialized. It's not necessarily transferable to other domains, even closely related ones. So, for example, an immunologist is different to an epidemiologist, and each will reach the limit of their knowledge of the other subject, as far as experts go, fairly quickly, even though to the layperson they might seem like they all know much, well, in fact, maybe they do know more about both than most people do. Now, this idea of the authoritative scientist is idealized in the form of an individual scientist who exemplifies intellectual virtue. But as I keep saying, ultimately this epistemic authority is collective, not individual. So what we need to achieve is social engineering to manage the fundamental tension of epistemic life. It's a tension in everyday life, and it's also a tension in scientific life, because there's two fundamental epistemic goals. Believe what's true. This is like do the good, right? You think to yourself, what do I need to do? And the answer is do good. But there's another thing that you ought to strive towards. You ought to strive to not believe what's false, which is analogous to not doing the bad. And the tension is there because if I want to never do bad, I can just stay in, never do anything, then I won't do anything bad, but of course I won't do anything good. Similarly, if I want to not believe what's false, I can not believe anything, but then I'll miss out on believing what's true. If I want to only believe what's true, then I should believe whatever people tell me, believe whatever's on the internet, believe whatever's in the newspaper. Some of it's true. I'll get some true beliefs that way. Problem is, I'll end up with some false beliefs as well. And the challenge is to steer between these two goals in conditions of uncertainty. And this is fallible and requires judgment, and to some extent can't be codified. We all vary in our responsiveness to data, in our epistemic caution, and our behavioral response. Now, here's an analogy. Imagine you're sitting on the beach, everybody's having fun, and then a couple of people stand up and start looking at the horizon. And then one or two of them just turn and run. And others say, everyone run, run, everyone run, and they turn and run. And other people start looking at the horizon. And some of those people are peering at the horizon intently. And some people start to explain that although this thing on the horizon looks very small at the moment, hardly any kind of threat, they know from past experience that it's going to come closer. And when it comes closer, it's going to be bigger. And when it hits, it's going to devastate the beach and everyone needs to get away. This is a classic example of inductive knowledge based on experience. That is to say, the people who got up and run knew what tsunamis are like. They've seen them before. This is exactly the situation we had with the COVID epidemic in January, February among the scientific community. Certainly in the outside of kind of the official pronouncements of government and whatever, the scientific community was in general predicting a pandemic, certainly an epidemic in Britain, and were calling for measures way in advance of any measures being taken. Now, like the early warning people, the people who knew about the tsunami as soon as they saw the little thing on the horizon. But note that even among the sophisticates, there'll have been some degree of difference. Some people will have seen the slightest glimmer of a tsunami on the horizon and immediately started running. Others will have thought, well, hold on, I'm not sure about that. Is that really a tsunami there? I need to have a bit of a closer look. And that need for more data, the idea that we could always wait and see to be more sure, is a general feature of epistemic life. You will have heard a lot of talk about trials of vaccines. We need a large sample size to have a significant result from a trial, but how big is big enough? Well, how big does the wave on the horizon need to be before you're sure it's a wave, not a trick of the light? The answer is it's somewhat imponderable. We could always benefit from having a bigger sample size in a drug trial. And we'd always be more sure it's a tsunami the bigger and closer it gets. But the cost of inaction is great. And so we have to balance the need for more data and to be more sure with the danger of failing to believe something in time and therefore suffering the terrible consequences. So in the relatively short amount of time remaining, I think I've probably got 5 minutes, let me say some more about how we can better understand the limitations of the reliability of science. There's descriptive failure, there's predictive failure, and there's explanatory failure. And in general, we can say that description is more reliable than prediction, which is more reliable than explanation. So, for example, describing the fact that everybody's already got a disease is easier than predicting that everyone is going to get a disease, which is easier than explaining why everybody has got the disease. Science is based on the Beckettian idea of fail, fail again, and fail better. But sometimes there can be whole areas of science which are fairly unreliable. So at this point, we really need to distinguish, and we should have done already, between different kinds of science, because different kinds of science differ greatly in their reliability. So for example, on the whole, we might say the physical sciences are more accurate and more reliable than the life sciences, especially, say, for example, when it comes to prediction. Very hard to predict how evolution is going to unfold, very hard to predict how living systems will behave. Much easier to predict physical systems, although even some physical systems are very hard to predict. Then we have natural versus social science. Social science, implicitly or explicitly, often involves our values, and there may be instances of social sciences that have achieved very little by way of explanatory and predictive success, and sometimes even very little by way of descriptive success. And then another term that's sometimes used is behavioral science. And this is really just an alternative definition of sorts what used to be called social science. But here I'm thinking of economics, psychology, and so on. Again, reliability is much more limited. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should be unthinkingly, uncritically trusting of science. Sometimes, perhaps when you're talking to your boss, you should have in mind the question, why is this liar lying to me? That's a good rule of thumb to have. You know, someone might be trying to deceive you, especially if they're in a position of power, especially if they stand to gain from the situation in some way or other. We know a lot about when science is unreliable. Science fraud, and science hype, and science overreach are all relatively common problems. They're all exacerbated by the need for scientists to sell themselves to the wider community, as opposed to scientists achieving the respect of their peers within the community. And so to the extent to which we change the incentive structure of individual scientists, I think we threaten the reliability of science. As it stands in many areas of science, admitting you were wrong gets you respect. This doesn't happen in other areas of life. In science in general, people are praised for criticizing and challenging authority and received wisdom, as long as they do it in an evidence-based and rational way. But there are many forces undermining those virtues and norms of the scientific community, and therefore threatening the engineering which has made it as reliable as it is. Now, here are some important examples: asbestos, diesel fumes, lead in paint. In all these cases, there were powerful commercial interests distorting the scientific process. Science skepticism often supports the status quo, though, because taking action to ban something requires kind of certainty, right? If you're going to undermine people's livelihoods by stopping them selling asbestos, then you need to be sure. And so if we are able to spread doubt, that will be sufficient to cause inaction, and inaction will lead to a continuation of the status quo. And this is one of the reasons why many people who stand to lose from scientific knowledge, as in the cases I've mentioned, have promoted science skepticism. There's no need to get people to believe falsehoods if you can just get them to be less sure.
No more
about
hassle,
everything.
no more swearing, no more threats, no more banging on the walls, okay?
Yeah.
I wasn't banging the walls, but I might do later. You know, you get people to be less sure about everything, distort and undermine rational debate. What you basically do by doing that is undermine the social processes that lead to reliability. Okay, well, I give you a few examples. One of the best examples is Newtonian mechanics. It is highly empirically accurate to 1 part in 10 to the 7, mind-bogglingly accurate compared to almost any science subsequently outside of physics, and yet known to be completely wrong for some domains. Lots of people think of examples like this as bolstering science skepticism. However, actually, in these cases, usually abandoned theories are retained as limiting cases. And past theories that are wrong in physical science are usually, if not always, approximately true, and often highly so. The emergent properties that are most important to me of science, I would say, are that science collectively has had the following features: that it tracks the truth, it corrects its own errors. So as Asimov famously said, if you think the Earth's flat, you're wrong. If you think the Earth's spherical, you're wrong. But if you think that it's just as wrong that the Earth is flat as that it's spherical, you're even more wrong than the first two people. The Earth is flat to a high degree of approximation at relatively familiar length scales to us because it's very big. It's almost completely spherical, but Newton's theory of gravity predicted that it's in fact flattened at the poles, and it was found to be so by various expeditions in the 18th century, confirming Newton's theory, much to the consternation of some members of the French Academy who really didn't want Newton's theory to turn out to be correct. So in the physical sciences, science more generally, the idea is we don't get to the truth straight away, but we have processes which correct error endogenously. That is to say, science generates its own internal error correction. It doesn't get corrected from the outside. And if you look at most of the cases of scientific theories where there's been radical theory change, it's scientists themselves who produced evidence that have led to the revision and correction of the theories of other scientists, rather than some sort of exogenous external correction. Of course, when it comes to truth, the problem is things are very complicated. What's true of the population need not be true of every individual. And
yeah.
So one more. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about causation. So I was just going to point out, for example, that you might want from a scientist an answer like, did the patient die because of ? Why did the patient die? And the problem is that in many cases of causation, there's no simple answer. So here's an analogy. Suppose there's a traffic accident and we ask, why did the accident happen? Well, a road designer might be asking, why did the accident happen at that junction? There's always accidents at that junction. How come there aren't so many accidents at the other junction? Ah, the cause of the accident is visibility at the junction. A car designer might say, why did that car crash at that junction when lots of other cars didn't crash at that junction? Ah, failure to have anti-lock brakes caused the car to crash. Accident investigator might say, why did that driver crash that car at that junction when other similar drivers didn't crash similar cars at the same junction? Oh, because the driver was tired or the driver had been drinking. In every case, to some extent, there's a cause that's been identified. But if you ask a simple question like, what was the cause? Is it true that the cause was the driver's drinking? You're not going to get anything other than a nuanced answer. And unfortunately, that's one of the major problems with people's understanding of the reliability of science, is that they often want science to deliver simple answers where often what's delivered is complicated answers that are hedged in various ways. Okay, well, look, I've whistled through a lot of slides. I hope I've had enough to say to promote some discussion and to be some interest to you all. And I'll thank you for your attention, if you have been paying attention, and finish there.
Yes, there was a question from Daniel about pseudoscience. When science appears to fail, for example, scientific racism of the 18th century, is this even science? It looks like science at some level because there's experiments, there's measurements, but it could just be called pseudoscience. If these types of failings are brushed off as pseudoscience, then what does it mean to say science can fail?
Yeah, good. Well, I think I've written a bit about the definition of pseudoscience. I think sometimes there is pseudoscience within science. But I mean, the line between bad science and pseudoscience is always a difficult one to draw. I think it becomes pseudoscience when, rather than it being, I mean, so bad science could be either science fraud, I just make up some results, or it could be sort of incompetent science, right? So I could just I could just misread my instruments if I wasn't very good experimenter, or in fact, I mean, just not be very good at doing experiments, which are actually really hard to do, of course. You wouldn't want to call those things pseudoscience, even though they're bad science, right? So I think pseudoscience is kind of fake science. It's something that has the trappings of being scientific when it's not scientific. And to that extent, I would say something like scientific racism of the 18th century is pseudoscience, because it never even comes close to being empirically well supported. So what it means to say that science can fail is much more general than it being pseudoscientific. It can fail by being done badly, or just being unlucky. I mean, I think this is a really important part of what I'm trying to say here, right? So I didn't have long enough. In fact, no, there's never long enough. But so here's a kind of epistemic situation I'm imagining. You're a biologist, a zoologist. You're classifying birds and their properties. Ravens are black everywhere you go. Swans are white everywhere you go. Eventually you get enough data for whatever degree of epistemic caution you have to be overcome. And you say, you know what, I reckon all ravens are black. And you say, I reckon all swans are white. Now, it just turns out that Australia has non-white swans. And it doesn't have any non-black corvids. It doesn't have any non-black ravens. So the person who made the inference to all ravens are black ends up being more reliable, but there's nothing more virtuous, anything better about what they've done. It's just luck, right? It just happens that swans are found in Australia and they're not white. So I think, you know, sometimes there can be situations in which everything is epistemically, we're doing everything epistemically right, and we're just unlucky, and we make the wrong, we believe something false. So we don't want to, in just the same way that moral luck means that a virtuous person can end up causing a bad outcome. Not the same way, but an analogous way. Anyway, any other questions?
Yeah, so recently I attended another online talk, and it was a discussion of poor quality papers being published in peer-reviewed journals, and there was lots of examples presented by the speaker of some really basic statistical errors, some others that were fraud. You know, he highlighted the problems of peer review and sort of basically saying the system's broken, peers don't sort of show up and do their job, so to speak. I wondered if you would agree with that, and whether, you know, we humanists and skeptics kind of overrate peer review, sort of put it on a pedestal when it's not actually what we think it might be.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Was it Don Brabham that you heard talk about this topic?
It was a chap called Nick Brown, Dr. Nick Brown.
Okay. I know Don Brabham has been on a crusade about peer review, and part of the reason is because there are many instances of groundbreaking discoveries that have failed peer review. So the problem with peer review is that it can lead to the entrenchment of received opinion. I'm tempted to sort of repeat what I said before about the worst system apart from all the rest. That, you know, I sort of think peer review's got loads of faults. I'm not sure what would be better though. I think the answer to your question varies greatly from field to field, and from journal to journal and discipline to discipline. And I think that people in the community might well know, okay, the peer review, you know, the editing and peer reviewing of that journal is not good, and so on. I think it may have declined in quality, and I think part of the reason is that there's so much pressure. Everyone's so busy, right? So this is not just in everyday life, it's scientists as well. I mean, everything's more specialized, there's more knowledge, there's more to do. And so, and more papers are produced all the time. And there's so much to peer review. So a common thing might be that some expert gets sent a paper to peer review, and they hand it to their postdoc or their graduate student and have the graduate student peer review it. And sometimes that might result in a better job than the expert, or than the more senior person, because the graduate student really is actually an expert, even though they're not more senior, they're an expert enough in the field, and also because they're so sort of excited to have this important task, they take it really seriously, they work really hard on it. Whereas a senior person might be more blasé, you know, oh, well, another paper for Nature to review. Yeah, I do that all the time. And they cast their eye over it. And they, you know, scientists are no more, I don't think, I mean, certainly not immune from hubris, right? Or thinking that they can just sort of look at something and know because they can just see what's good. So, so I certainly don't think peer review is sufficient for quality. I don't think it's necessary these days for dissemination at all, because certainly in the field I work in physics, people use this archive, which you can download papers from for free. Anyone can download them, and anyone who's written anything can publish their paper on that archive, and anyone can read it. So so peer review is more about giving things some kind of stamp of authority. And here, maybe there is a problem with too many journals, and too much demand for people to publish. So the idea that you're only a successful scientist if you publish a lot, this disincentivizes people from doing things like checking other people's work. Now, if you check other people's work, and most of the time you don't find anything, but it's vital to the scientific enterprise that some people check things. So we're creating a situation where a scientist can no longer stand before their human resources manager or whatever and just report being a good scientist, and that be considered enough. And that's really unfortunate. I think that's potentially very dangerous, and we might see science to some extent unraveling. I think a huge amount of what I've had to say has been about a kind of science that's brought us to the point of sort of the peak of knowledge, and that you know, in some fields might have happened already, and we might already be in decline. I don't know. I mean, things might be getting epistemically worse. I'm not really sure. At least I think probably with behavioral science and psychology, I think, no, it's not getting epistemically worse at all, because although there's been the replicability crisis, there's also been a huge amount of work by loads of people trying to correct it and thinking really hard about how to improve what they're doing. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
Greg, would you like to, hang on, let me get you unmuted.
Okay. I'm muted now, yeah. Yeah, James, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I was actually an active scientist for very many years, and one of the things that's, before I ask the main question I was going to ask, I'll just say this about peer review. When I had my papers peer reviewed, I could always, or nearly always, guess the identity of the reviewer from what they said. And quite a lot of the time, it is a rubber stamp. It's basically, what happens is that the main people in the field are recognised and their papers are kind of rubber stamped and published. People who are not so well known have a much harder time. And that's just an observation about peer review. But the real question I wanted to ask you was this. In publishing science in particular, there seems to me to be a degree of trust. I was involved many years ago in 1998. I know your speciality appears to be physical science, but I'm a biologist. I was involved in assessing Wakefield's work. Do you know about Wakefield? He was the guy who
I know.
made the claim about autism and measles. The people who assessed his work actually took it to be true to begin with. And it only turned out later that it was totally fraudulent. Now, I wonder, that was a very big claim. I wonder how many smaller claims are being made in a similar manner, because as you say, the pressure is on people to publish. If you apply for a job in science, in my time anyway, they weighed your publications. They didn't really look at your teaching or anything like that. So I wonder really whether the trust is warranted, because if you have a paper to review, for example, you assume that the data that's in it is genuine. You don't question it. What you do is question maybe the methodology and interpretation. So the question I want to ask you is, how widespread would you say scientific fraud is actually? Is it more widespread than we think?
Well, look, I think a lot of it isn't fraud, because I think a lot of it is people not really realizing what they're doing and using weak methodology because that's sort of what they learned and just churning stuff out. And this is what they sometimes call p-hacking. So I'm not sure how much of it is fraud. That's one thing I'd say. I don't think there's actually probably that much fraud, but I don't know. I mean, how does one say? I know there have been papers published that say, 99% of all published findings are false. In certain fields, I think what one can only say is that you have to rely upon the long run, and of course in the long run we're all dead, so that's not always enough for practical purposes. I mean, it does seem to be that usually, or at least in many cases, falsehoods that are entrenched for a long time have eventually been exposed, and heterodox theories that have been unfairly rejected, for example, epigenetics, have eventually been accepted. But yeah, I mean, I think that's why I was saying, you know, science is the worst system apart from all the rest. I mean, there are just loads of faults. One can find fault everywhere. And so the solution is, we know what we need to do better. We need to check, we need to not hype, we need to be patient and so on. But the reasons for the failings within science, I think, are just comparable to reasons for failings more generally. It's just human frailty. Science is absolutely not immune from it, but better than most other ways of finding things out, it to some extent manages to be more reliable than not about lots of things, and in many cases, extremely reliable, unprecedentedly reliable in a way that coordinates across masses of different scientific fields. So when was the last time you got a text message that had a mistake in it due to anything other than user error?
Okay, Claire's asked something slightly different. She said, what can I say to people who believe in homeopathy? As a trained scientist, I'm flabbergasted, but I want to talk to them in a way that is respectful and helpful.
Yeah, I think this is really difficult, because I think when it comes to people's individual beliefs, I mean, it very much depends. I mean, you may have people whose beliefs are tied into their ways of life and their communities and their traditions and so on. So you have to be very sensitive about how you talk to them about it. I mean, I'm not, I wouldn't claim any expertise in knowing how to help other people epistemically debug other people. So I don't really want to comment about that. I wouldn't want to give anybody advice about what to say to somebody. I mean, because, potentially someone might use homeopathy and the placebo effect might, if I told them not to take the placebo, that might actually be bad for them. And I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to tell anybody to do anything, nor am I going to tell anybody to do anything.
Right, Alex, I've unmuted you. Do you want to ask your question?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it seems a bit of a shame to throw his name into the pot, given his recent escapades. But Dominic Cummings is someone who's put forward the view throughout his career, really, of having changed in the traditional the process of government in order to fill more positions with scientists and expertise in more technological areas than just politics. And I was wondering where you stood on that sort of change in the future.
Yeah, it depends what's meant by that, I think. And so one of the things I think what I was trying to say in my talk was that if you look at the degree of knowledge that we sort of enter the 20th century with, there are all these institutions, things like the National Laboratory for Weights and Measures, the Met Office, all these Office for National Statistics. And what these are is like, they're arm's length from the state. Right? So give you an example, the British Antarctic Survey, that discovered the hole in the ozone layer. They discovered the hole in the ozone layer because they were just in the Antarctic making measurements pointlessly, really. And they didn't know what they were looking for. Anyway, the point about these kinds of institutions is that they have a certain degree of independence and they're able to foster a certain ethos and certain values. So they're not there to make money. They're not there to be popular. they're there to find out knowledge, to find things out, to produce reliable belief, to produce knowledge. And what I worry about is the independence of scientific institutions being threatened. So, I mean, obviously there have been commercial institutions that have made great discoveries, and Bell Labs in the US would be a classic example of a privately funded, commercially funded research institute that made profound discoveries. So I'm not saying that the only way to have science is for all to be done by the state or anything like that. But I think what's very important is that there are institutions that are told and dedicated to knowledge rather than anything else. Now that doesn't mean that those institutions can't be corrupted and that won't be subject to human frailty. But it does make for more reliability than if you just have everyone simultaneously trying to sort of find things out and make money out of it at the same time, because that just introduces fairly obvious conflicts of interest that get in the way. So, as I say, I'm not saying that we don't find, people in private industry and private enterprise don't find out truths. They do. But I am saying that I think I would like to defend certain institutions as having a role where they're not directly part of the state because they're outside of governmental control. They're not political appointments. They shouldn't be political appointments. And they're also outside of corporate control. And then, civil society and democracy is based on those voices feeding into debate. And, nobody's thinking for a moment that they get to determine what happens. But debate is going to be a lot better if there are those voices contributing, as well as commercial interests and political interests and all the other interest groups within society as well. So I would like to know a lot more about what he has in mind. And I think the overriding important thing is that we live in an age in which universities have been marketized. And the fundamental principle of the market is caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Right? That's based on the fact that there's essentially a competition. The buyer wants to buy the product as cheaply as possible, and the seller wants to sell it as expensively as possible. Now, when we're talking about education or science, we have a collective endeavor. I want to be proved wrong if I'm wrong. I want my papers and my book to fall into disrepute if they're erroneous. Because the goal is not, the goal is for us all collectively to find out the truth. And my conception of what it is that I do as a university professor is to enter into, to inculcate students into the culture of inquiry that I'm part of, which I was introduced to by my teachers, and which I'm still part of now because I'm still a student. So what I worry about very much is this kind of reductive attitude to human beings that says, well, everything is a market transaction. I have no problem with market transactions, but if you reduce everything to them, you're apt to destroy the emergent properties of the social organization that is science, I would say.
Okay, Paul. Oh, sorry, I've lost everybody. Paul, do you want to ask a question now? You said you've got your...
Is that working?
Yep.
Great. So the question I've got is to do with the relationship between science and axioms, and in particular, the relation to game theory. So game theory seems to be axiomatic. You just used it a moment ago. And how can that, it seems to me it's an assumption that maths and everything else is working on. How do you test the theory of an axiom like game theory?
Yeah, good one. Now I get to tell you the Sidney Morgenbesser joke. So Sidney Morgenbesser goes into bagel shop, and he says, "What kind of bagels have you got?" And the shopkeeper says, "I've got cinnamon and raisin, and I've got plain, and I might have some seeded ones out the back." And Sydney says, "I'll have plain unless you've got some seeded ones out the back, in which case I'll have cinnamon and raisin." Now, this is violating an axiom of decision theory. And of course, human beings often violate that axiom, especially children. Often the unavailability, what's it, an unavailable, an alternative that's unavailable that you wouldn't choose if it was available shouldn't make a difference to your choice between things. So what I would say is, in general, in science, you can have, I mean, take another example. Like take Newton's second law. It's an axiom. And it effectively defines force as rate of change of momentum. Really, the proof is in the pudding, right? If the axiom, together with other axioms, gives you a theory which enables you to describe, predict, explain the world, that vindicates the axioms. Otherwise, it's maths, or it's metaphysics, or it's pure thought. That's what I would say. So I would say the axioms of decision theory, in certain situations, people approximate them fairly well. Then their preferences satisfy the axiom of decision theory. That means they're representable by a utility function, and then we can do some maths and do some modeling. But really, the test of it is the degree to which it's predictive and explanatory and descriptive, and that's an empirical matter, no matter how good the axiom seems a priori.
I mean, the question with game theory, though, is everyone is assuming it's a zero-sum game, when biology is patently a positive-sum game on any time scale that's meaningful to, well, a short time scale, even or a time scale that's much longer than the one that we can conceive. But everything is assuming that it's zero-sum. And that's, so we're having a catastrophe because of that.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I certainly I don't know anyone who assumes that it's a zero-sum game.
But that's the essence of game theory. It's all based on zero-sum.
No, game theory is just a formal framework that describes all sorts of games. I mean, zero-sum is just one kind of game, and
But whenever people talk about things being game theoretic, including lots of serious evolutionary biologists, they always assume that it's zero-sum. I mean, all the Darwinian evolutionary theorists seem to buy that completely.
Okay, well, I mean, that's something I won't comment on without knowing more about.
Yeah, we've only got a few more minutes for questions, so I think we'll have to leave it there, Paul. Okay. Oh, sorry, the things get covered up and people move around. Where's Alan? Oh, there's Alan. Alan, do you want to ask your question? Oh, hang on. Sorry. Bye. Oh. Okay, sorry, you're moving around my screen. I'm not sure why.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
All right, yeah. Getting away from the I'm not going to talk about Karl Popper. I'm not going to talk about epistemology. I'm going to talk about sometimes. It was already been mentioned about a couple of things like marketization of the universities, of research, the pressure on scientists to produce the next paper that's going to be published. And the big pressure on there is to have a positive result, as it's called, rather than saying, I'm going to check somebody else's stuff and see if it's right or wrong, which is an essential, it is the essential part of the scientific process. There's a big pressure on, I'm going to do right my hypothesis, this is my positive thing. These things are not uncommon in the past, but they're very noticeable at the moment. And also, I think something that I tend to worry a lot about is we've seen scientists co-opted, health scientists co-opted by our government at the moment, as opposed to ignored by the American government and sacked by the American government. And there's always been a tendency to co-opt scientists by some governments. How do we avoid these things? How do we? Because I think this marketisation thing makes this worse, makes it harder for scientists to not be co-opted.
Yeah, I agree. And so that is what I was talking about before. So I think what you need is independent institutions, and they shouldn't be co-opted, and they should maintain their independence, and they should refuse to be co-opted. And so, of course, loads of what the public get as science is actually science mediated and modulated and transformed in the form of public health advice or other kind of government advice or advice from business or somebody else or a drug company or whatever. Even school children get science as sort of simplified for them, and then sometimes they're frustrated when they find out that something they've been told as gospel is actually really just an approximation. So I mean, I think the answer is the way that we solve this problem is by having a clear understanding of the need to have independent institutions that are governed by epistemic values, and then we have to bring about the political will where the people have to demand those institutions. So there's a sense in which I think what's happening at the moment is people are trying to demand many people are demanding the destruction of those institutions, right? That's what's happening at the moment. And what we should be doing is demanding that we save and strengthen those institutions.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more quick question. I don't know if anybody's got such a thing that they'd like to ask. There's been a lot of discussion on the chats actually, James. I don't know if you've seen that.
On to something now.
Okay, I can't see any more hands up. So, oh, Anthony, hang on, let me unmute you. Okay.
Yeah, hi James, thanks for that. So my question was, what features do you think need to be present in a scientific community for it to be the case that the community has reached a consensus? And do you think those features are present in the current kind of scientific debate about coronavirus and the policies that are being recommended and things like that?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I think that consensus often becomes clear in hindsight. I mean, one answer is maybe something like when it starts going in textbooks, there's definitely a consensus. That's a kind of functional answer, I think. When people stop teaching the alternative routinely, so an interesting case would be Lavoisian chemistry. You really see the acceptance of Lavoisian chemistry and the rejection of phlogiston theory, which is completely dominant up till 1760s, 70s, 80s. And then afterwards, you really see it in the textbooks. The textbooks start being written with the new chemistry. So another way you could say is, well, something becomes really established when it starts being used as background knowledge in other areas of science. So for example, something about the periodic table, right? It's not, the periodic table is being used every day in the whole of, geochemistry or biology or, so that's evidence of deep entrenchment, I think. you know, on a shorter time scale, I think it's harder to see. So one of the things I learned about complex systems is some things you only see on some scales. And I think that maybe it's a bit like that with, take an individual human decision, right? So suppose you're going to decide, you know, what to have for your dinner. Now, at some point you were undecided, and at some point you were decided. And one might say over a time scale of sort of a half an hour, we can say, yeah, you decided what to have for dinner at 8 o'clock, because that's when you went down the shops and bought what you needed, right? But, you know, on a shorter time scale, was there an exact minute when you decided? I think no, you know, it's kind of emergent over a time scale. I think lots of things are like this. And so I would say with scientific theory choice, we can say, look, the scientific community adopted special relativity. But there wasn't a date or an event, you know. It's just that when you look back, you can say, you know, over this period, that theory became accepted, and all the chatter and the dispute and died out. Now, I think we're on much too short a time scale for that to be true in the current situation. And I think, you know, we just have to be really clear about the distinction between scientific factors and economic, social, political factors. So I mean, there are diseases which, because of our social condition, luckily at the moment, here in Bristol, they just don't exist here. But if we were malnourished, then there would be all sorts of diseases we would be susceptible to. Currently, there's no political need to manage those infections because they're not, you know, like cholera, right? You know, it's just not an issue. We don't think of cholera as a medical issue, right? But that's because we've got sanitation. And of course, in the 19th century, the sanitationists were those sort of crazy, loony radicals that thought that clean water should be provided for everyone, John Stuart Mill being one among their number. And that was a radical view, can you imagine? A radical view that we should have clean water. So I think, you know, you've got to see that in all of these kind of public health issues, the interaction between social, economic factors and political factors, and science is just part of the picture, and it's in some ways it's a small part of the picture.
Thanks, James. I think we're going to have to leave it there. That fantastic talk, really wonderful and great discussion too. I'm really sorry that we can't go on. Just to say to everybody that James is going to let us have his slides, so those will be available through the website, and also it'll be on our YouTube channel, a recording of this talk. So do take the chance to listen again, because certainly there are things I'd like to hear again. Thank you very, very much.